everyone. So it's noon, so I'll go ahead and get us started. Thank you so much for joining our Lunch and Learn webinar today. My name is Lacey. I'm CAM's Administrative Coordinator, and I'm just going to start with a couple of housekeeping tips. First of all, the webinar is being recorded and it will be posted to YouTube following today's presentation. Live captioning is available for the program today. I have pasted the link where you can access those captions in the chat box, and I will paste it again for those of you who are still joining. The presenters will accept questions at the very end of the presentation, and you can type your question in the Q&A box by clicking that Q&A icon that should be at the bottom of your screen. Our moderator will monitor that question and answer period at the end, as well as the chat box throughout the webinar, and I will help as well. And if you have any technical issues, please feel free to message me using the chat box or send me an email at admin@calmuseums.org, and I will do my best to address the issue. So now I'm going to turn it over to Tomoko Kuta, who is the chair of CAM's program committee, to introduce our program today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lacey, and thank you everyone for joining us on this very important webinar. Before we get started, I would love to read a land acknowledgement. As we begin this event, we acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our various regions. And land acknowledgement is a critical step towards working with Native communities to secure meaningful partnership and inclusion in the stewardship and protection of their cultural resources and homelands. Our institutions were founded upon exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples. We honor and are grateful for the land we occupy and recognize the ongoing damage of settler colonialism. Let's take a moment to honor these ancestral grounds that we are collectively gathered upon and support the resilience and strength that all Indigenous people have shown worldwide. I am on the traditional territory of the Kumeyaay people. I encourage you to name and acknowledge the Native peoples where you are located in the chat box today. So I'm seeing some great responses from the group. Thank you so much for sharing. I'd like to acknowledge the sponsors of our webinar series, the Lunch and Learn. CAM's free Lunch and Learn webinar program is supported in part by Associated Foundations, Incorporated, in memory of Barry Herlihy. Live captioning is supported in part by the National Arts and Disability Center at the University of California, Los Angeles, and Ability Central. CAM is supported in part by a grant from the National Arts Council, a state agency. And with that, I would like to introduce today's moderator for the program. The program is called Museums on the Edge, Stories of Transformation and Failure. Juan Govea is today's moderator. He is a director of community engagement at the Pacific Grove Museum of Natural History. In his 4 years leading the exhibits, education team, and communications of the museum, he has focused on creating community-centric programming that highlights the local environment and cultural histories while empowering students, visitors, and community members. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to the group.
Thank you so much, Tomoko. I appreciate the introduction. And welcome to everybody who's visiting us today. I had to do the math to see how many days ago we were at CAM, and it looks like about 3 or 4 months ago, and it feels like about 10 years. But the lessons that we are going to talk about today, I think, resonate even more in this time of uncertainty. So it's an honor to be here with these three incredible people again, and thank you guys for letting me jump on stage with you. But with that, I would love to jump into some of the stories and lessons that we can learn. So I'd love to start by introducing Dr. Susana Bautista. She's been a museum professional and art historian for over 30 years, has led museums and cultural institutions, as well as being a curator and critic of Latinx, Chicanx, and Latin American art, and has worked in places such as Greece, New York, and Los Angeles. She received her PhD in communications from the University of Southern California, as well as her master's degree in art history and museum studies. Her 2013 book is entitled Museums in the Digital Age, Changing Meanings of Place, Community, and Culture, and she is taught at USC Annenberg School of Communication and Claremont Graduate University's Art Management Program. She has served as the Executive Director of the USC Pacific Asia Museum, as well as the Executive Director of the Pasadena Museum of California Art, which she'll be speaking about today. She is currently the Senior Curator at Large for LA Plaza de Cultura y Artes, Art Consultation for Ultimate Health Services, and Lead Consultant for Teen Tix LA. And she also serves on the Board of Trustees for the American Alliance of Museums. Born in Pasadena, she now resides in LA with her family. Please join me in welcoming Susana. Susana, it's great to see you again.
Thank you so much, Juan. Okay, I'm going to share my slides. All right, so we are starting with a story of failure and ending on a positive note with two successful transformations. I'm going to be describing the failure of the Pasadena Museum of California Art that opened in 2002. I was the fourth executive director hired early 2017 after Jay Bololi, who served as interim executive director for nearly 2 years. I'll discuss what I believe to be the 4 basic reasons for the closure: founder syndrome, lack of transparency and accountability, lack of long-range planning, high staff turnover, and low salaries. I'll then discuss how it closed, realistically. The PMCA was designed by the firm MDA Johnson Favaro. Museum founders Robert and Arlene Oltman paid $5 million for its design and construction. The Oltmans purchased an empty lot, wanting a more urban lifestyle. Their plan was to live on the 3rd floor and rent out the 2nd floor. They considered office spaces as well as starting a bed and breakfast or a boutique hotel. Then someone suggested that they start an art gallery since they had a small art collection. They realized that they would need educational programs to claim tax deductions, so they decided to create a nonprofit museum. Their founding director, Wesley Jessup, encouraged the Oltmans to instead consider a non-collecting museum with rotating exhibitions, which they did. On the left is the stairway to the 2nd floor. On the right is the museum lobby. The 3rd floor terrace. On the very right, you can see the glass doors leading to the Oltmans' apartment. This was the living room of the Oltmans' apartment. Shortly after the museum opened, they allowed the museum to use this space that was later called the Founders Gallery. This is the main gallery on the 2nd floor, 8,000 square feet of exhibition space. On the left is the South Gallery with 2,000 square feet, and on the right is the project room. 10,000 square foot garage and storage room with a mural painted by LA artist Kenny Scharf in 2004 that has now been completely painted over. Since the museum opened, both Robert and Arlene had positions on the board. They lived on the 3rd floor, they had 2 parking spaces in the garage, they owned 2 buildings, the museum and a smaller building and back for staff offices. The museum had leases for both spaces, which held the museum responsible for all building repairs, maintenance, and upgrades, and $152,400 rent a year. The exact amount of rent was paid back to the museum by the Oltmans as a tax-deductible donation every year end. During each exhibition installation, the Oltmans hosted lunch for staff and installers in the Founders Gallery. They were like the mom and pop of the museum, regularly coming around offices to see how things were going, changing light bulbs, collecting their mail from the front desk. When the museum opened, they promised to provide $400,000 for 5 years, but they continued supporting the museum financially until the very end, between $100,000 and $150,000 each year, not counting the reimbursements. I need to note here that a year after the PMCA's closure, 2 other museums closed in LA, the Main Museum and the Marciano Art Foundation, both with prominent founders, one with serious staff problems and the other without a lease. So what were some of the warning signs that could have alerted staff and board to potential problems? There were plenty of financial warnings. When Jessup left in 2008, the budget was $1.5 million and only decreased from that time, with several substantial deficits along the way. Revenues from the store, membership, and outside rentals had dropped. During the 3rd executive director Jenkins Shannon's last year, she stopped paying herself. The board chair knew about this, as did other board members, who kept telling her not to do it, but there just wasn't enough money coming in. So when she left in 2015, the museum had to set up a plan to pay her all that back salary. Part of the problem was an unbalanced revenue stream. You can see a big reliance on contributions from the board, with minimal foundation grants, corporate and government contributions, and no endowment. If you add up all the individual gifts, the total average between 21 and 55%. On the right, we can compare with the Association of Art Museum Directors' annual benchmarking report from 2015. Relying heavily on individual giving is risky. One of the museum's largest individual donors and longtime board member, Chairman Emeritus, died in 2014. He left nothing for the museum. There was no endowment, no cash reserve or maintenance fund, and the museum had no assets and no bank credit line. It was the same situation when I started 3 years later. Yes, there was a board treasurer, and yes, he provided regular financial reports at board meetings, but those reports were not easy to read. The treasurer was an investment banker. Revenue from outside rentals on the 3rd floor was important, but after complaints from neighbors about the noise, the city investigated and discovered that the entire 3rd floor was zoned only for residential use. The rest of the building was zoned for public use or for museum operations. In 2016, the museum began the lengthy process of rezoning with the city. This limited activities on the terrace to events that were officially hosted by the Oltmans. They committed to entirely fund the costs for design and construction, which was finally scheduled to begin summer 2018. The first problem with staff was the unprofessional relationship with the founders, who had their favorites that would regularly complain to them. The second was a tendency to hire from within, quickly and often without a formal search process. The third problem was low salaries, which partly explains number 2. The high rate of staff turnover was disregarded by board members, who proudly called the PMCA, quote, a training ground for museum professionals. In 2010, the PMCA hired consultants to create a 5-year strategic plan. But having a plan in hand does not always ensure good planning. There were 9 recommendations. Number 1 was followed, as was 2, 3, and 5. The problem was that the museum did not follow 4, 6, 7, 8, and 9. They did not hire a development director, but they hired a young development manager 3 years later with no fundraising track record. It would take them 8 years to figure out capital improvements on the 3rd floor, but they did not set aside funds for maintenance, and there were constant leaks and building problems. The board made a minimal commitment to fundraising, rarely inviting guests to museum openings and events. They did not start a fundraising campaign and did not pay their curator or development manager a $100,000 salary. They did eliminate certain board committees, art, education, bookstore, but there were no active board committees when I arrived. So on March 24th, we held a board retreat. The goal was to provide transparency about the museum's current situation and to encourage board support to strengthen the museum based on numerous positive steps. I'm going to show you 2 of the exact slides that were part of the presentation at that retreat. So we decided to put it all out on the table for them, a reality check. PMCA cannot continue in a cash flow crisis. We must professionalize operations and staff, resolve ownership of the building, needing clarity around the lease, and what the board of directors must do. And then we presented 4 options for the board to consider, each discussed in depth, reviewing both financial and legal implications. It worked. They were energized and hopeful about a stronger future. They voted unanimously to continue as an independent, nonprofit museum and to remain in the current location. An action plan was drafted, which turned into a stabilization plan because of insufficient progress. We set a deadline of September 30th for the board to address the matter again, giving time to go out into the community and enlist support, gather data and information, and consult with an attorney about the transfer of building ownership. But board members were not even paying their annual dues or fulfilling their pledges, let alone actively fundraise on behalf of the museum. There were numerous meetings with Robert Oltman to ask for his leadership during this critical time. The problem was that my transparency made it obvious that the Oltmans were still controlling the museum, and board members were not willing to pay for Bob's museum, as they called it, or to ask their friends for help. The Oltmans were unable to make a donation greater than their annual amount, not until the end of the year, and they were unwilling to talk to other board members or anyone else outside the museum to ask for support. So on June 11th, I get a call from the board chair telling me that at our next board meeting in 2 days, he will recommend that the museum close. The next day, I informed the deputy director and director of development, who are both scheduled to attend that meeting. At the meeting, the board chair skips over all the reports on the agenda, goes straight to his recommendation. He asked Robert Oltman to say something, who said that he intends to reopen the museum, and that often businesses need time to reassess and will reopen stronger than ever. Everyone expresses how sorry they are. Nobody asks staff to talk, but we do. Nobody asks about financials or funding prospects, about future exhibitions or about staff. They're ready to vote, but I state that 3 board members are absent. It doesn't matter, they say, we have a quorum. I insist, saying that for a decision like this, every single board member should be notified and have the right to vote. So they agree to wait. 3 days later is our scheduled opening reception for the summer exhibition season, and I say nothing. The following Monday, the remaining board members have been notified and vote to make a unanimous decision. And the next day, I inform the rest of the staff. There was no communication plan, no staffing plan, no lawyer, no financial analysis, no savings, no idea about who would cover operational expenses during the closure. Because once you announce that you're closing, there's not a single hope of any money coming in. In fact, donors start calling about their donations and members start calling about their benefits. There is a momentum to this process that you cannot pause or even slow down. Once I informed staff, it became public knowledge. So that same morning, I decided to have the Pasadena Star News break the story. There was no formal statement from the board. That took a week. So I only stated the facts, that the museum would close at the end of the recently opened exhibition season on October 7th. The fact was that we had no idea because the board's decision stated, quote, or earlier, depending on funding. They also hadn't decided whether they would just temporarily close down and reopen later, or whether they wanted a formal dissolution of the 501c3 entity. The Oltmans changed their minds 4 times until September 19, when they decided to close down for good on advice of their attorneys and tax consultants. Each time, the attorney had to start or stop again the process. I know this is all hard to read, but I wanted to give you an idea of all that is involved in closing down a museum from that June board meeting. Oops, sorry. In the lobby, we put up old membership renewal cards and asked visitors to write their comments, and I convinced the board to pay for a farewell party on the final date of the last exhibition. Sorry about that. Going through the legal process of dissolution reminds us that as a 501c3, the museum is a public charity whose tax-exempt status makes it formed for public or charitable purposes. And the board is legally accountable for exercising ultimate authority over all corporate activities, ensuring there are internal controls and that due care is taken. But in my opinion, responsibility for nonprofits lies also with the public. But what do we mean by the public? There's the government. The IRS oversees federal tax-exempt status of nonprofits. And for the state, there's the California Franchise Tax Board, the Secretary of State, and the Attorney General's office. And what about local government and their responsibility? Do they know what happens with all the nonprofits in their towns? Do they care about economic impact and their civic role? What about our donors and their charitable donations? Is it enough that foundations simply choose not to fund what they deem risky or suspect? And what about the public that the museum serves? They have a right to make sure they are benefiting. And for those who knew something was not quite right, what could they do? What would you do? What were some of the lessons that I learned from this experience? I knew before I took the job that the PMCA had financial problems. What museum doesn't struggle with finances? Don't just look at the current budget, but at all the financial statements to really understand a museum's overall financial health. Hire slow and fire fast. Wait until you can afford the best person for the job, even if you need to adjust your budget. Hire interim staff, short-term consultants to bring in new ideas or conduct an analysis, because firing is always harder. So take the time you need to make the right hire. But if you need to fire, do it quickly and move on. Everything starts and stops at the top. Don't underestimate the time and effort needed to build a strong board and maintain proper board functions. Take the time to get to know your board members, identify supporters, and bring on new board members that support you. Board chairs should be strong, and board commitment is not just writing checks. It was shocking for me to hear how many people didn't know about the museum after the closure was announced. The museum had great national media exposure, but too many locals didn't know about it. Museums have to be fully integrated into all parts of their communities, so you can easily go to them in times of need. If people don't know about you, they can't support you when you need them. The most important lesson for me was that of timing. If problems are not dealt with, they become part of your organizational culture. And we all know what Peter Drucker said about culture eating strategy. You will now hear from my colleagues about their success stories, which are even more important than ever as museums struggle to survive in these unprecedented times. Thanks for listening to my story.
And thank you, Susana, for sharing that story and the lessons that you learned. I want to remind everybody taking part today, please do take advantage of the Q&A function. Whenever you're thinking of a question, you can put it in there and we'll save it for the end. Transitioning into a different story. I'm really excited to introduce Elena Brokaw. Elena Brokaw has devoted her professional life to creating stronger communities. After earning her bachelor's in art history from Harvard, she returned to her hometown in Ventura, California, where she created 2 signature arts and cultural festivals and developed the first arts grants and public art programs for the city. After creating a United Arts Fund in Thousand Oaks, leading alumni relations at the American Film Institute, and facilitating cultural arts plans for cities like San Diego, Reno, and she returned to Ventura, where she became the director of the Department of Parks, Recreation, and Community Partnerships. For the past 4 years, she has served as the Barbara Barnard Smith Executive Director for the Museum of Ventura County, where she has worked with community volunteers, elected officials, government administrators, and museum staff to develop and implement a plan to sustain the museum into the next century. She has also created a consulting firm, Brokaw Jackson, which provides guidance on business and strategic planning for the nonprofit, public, and private sectors. Elena, welcome.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I am delighted to be here today. I'm really thankful to all of you who are attending and to all of the co-presenters for sharing their wisdom, and I always learn a lot. Second time I've heard this and I hear new things. I'm going to launch right in because our time here is limited. So I'm here to talk about the Museum of Ventura County, which almost closed. We are extraordinarily lucky that we were able to avoid the sad fate of the Pasadena Museum. My goal here is to share our story and point out some of the danger signs that we might have ignored to our detriment, and then hopefully share some ideas about what you can do if you do find yourself in a very deep hole. So a little bit about our museum. We were established back in 1913. For most of our century plus, we have served as the local historical society. We were homegrown, county funded, staffed by enthusiasts. Hopefully all of you have done traveling and gone into a little place like this. We focused on our collections and we showed all of our artifacts on display, or invisible storage, as we like to call it. So here is the museum back in the late 19-teens, actually. Everything you see on those shelves was everything that we had. And it was, to be honest, kind of a hodgepodge. To give you a sense of what you would see when you came to this museum, I will let you know that a lot of old timers here in our county, and I know some of you are on the audience here today, when you ask them what they remember seeing at the museum, they will tell you that they remember seeing this. This is our two-headed lamb. It was donated to us in 1928 from a farmer on Sexton Canyon. So that's sort of a sense of the kind of institution we were. In the late 1970s, the museum had so much collections or stuff that they constructed a new museum with 3 galleries. They went from one room to a new museum with 3 galleries and a library. On this slide, sorry, the way it shows up for me, it's cutting out some of the text on the right. But what I wrote there was in the 1970s, there was expansion and then a loss of funding. The new museum opened in 1977, and almost immediately thereafter, Prop 13 passed. Probably some of you remember that. And the county, which fully funded the museum, eliminated all funding. So the museum went from being 100% dependent on the county with increased costs to having no money from the county. And this is probably not the first crisis that the museum had, but it's the first sort of documented one. And the museum was literally saved by one donor. You can see that donor on your screen. It's not President Reagan. It's the one on the left. She was a pretty amazing woman, and she single-handedly funded that museum. And by that, I mean with her own donations and with some extremely effective fundraising. She paid some of the museum bills personally. She had donations sent to her house. Her personal secretary then deposited those donations. Let's just say that she was extremely invested in this museum, and probably a lot like the Oltmans were from the story that we just had. Now, again, I'm cutting it out on my screen, but down here on the right, you see some letters in yellow and bold. Those are the danger signs that I was talking about. So because this donor was so critical in their fundraising and actually paid about 75% of the museum's cost herself, the exhibits and programs heavily reflected her interests. And that is totally understandable. I can see doing that as a director, but it was a danger. And it was part of what got the museum into trouble later on. In 2000, that donor died, and the museum was in another pickle. How were they going to make up for that loss? And they decided that they needed to expand and become significantly more professional. They planned an expansion. The cost was estimated to be $10 million. They raised $6 million, and they were all set to break ground in 2008. We're in the midst of our own crisis right now. But before that, the recession, 2007, 8, 9, was something that we always thought about. So this is also a lesson that I don't think I realized when we first gave this presentation. But like, imagine if you were a museum that was set to do an expansion in March of 2020. Okay, so it's kind of the same situation. So our museum elected to continue forward. That might be a lesson for us today, that even though there are a lot of sunk costs, there's a lot already in, it may be time to just sit and take a beat and not do the expansion as planned. Another big problem here was that Not enough money was raised to do the whole expansion. Only a portion of it was ultimately built. And the money that was raised was mostly through naming opportunities that were tied to portions of the museum that were not built. Galleries, gardens, things like that. And those donors who had their names tied to those areas were not informed that their money was being used for something different, nor even asked. So that was a danger. That was a no-no for this museum, something to look out for. At the same time, the museum was also fundraising for a different museum in a town 15 miles away. That fundraising campaign was extraordinarily successful, and they raised more than they needed. So they put the additional money away into a temporarily restricted fund to fund the operations of this new museum. All right, so I'm going to take a pause here because this may be something a lot of you are dealing with right now. Our revenue streams just tanked, obviously, in March in almost every way. And some of you may have temporarily restricted funds that you are considering using to in this big crisis. That's how the museum felt. It had 2 new museums back here in 2012. They had opened 2 new museums. Their fundraising had gone way down, which is not surprising given that they had just done 2 capital campaigns. And they elected to borrow from those temporarily reserved funds to keep their operations going. There now may be a time to do that. And there may be times when that is a smart idea, but there are a couple of things to think about. This is a timeline that shows not only that there was a huge amount of, there was a revolving door in leadership, but also I want to point out the budget here. As you can see, hopefully you can see my cursor, in 2012, when they opened with 2 museums, the budget was 1.9 million. And this is when they started borrowing from that temporarily restricted fund. Well, that budget actually went up while they were continuing to borrow. So while they didn't have enough funds to keep it going, they increased the budget. And they kept that budget increased until 2016, and back in 2016 was when the reserve fund was depleted. So that is something to look out for. If you are going to borrow from your reserved funds, don't only borrow from your reserved funds. That has to be combined with doing some significant reductions in other areas. I included this just to show that not only was the turnover very high at the leadership level, it was on all levels of staff. This is a staff directory from 1 year. In 12 months, all these people had left. And this is what the collections looked like. I don't think any of you will be surprised to know that this was happening. I came to the museum in August of 2016, right when the reserve was depleted. The panic had set in. And what I was told when I came in as the interim director, is that we don't have enough money, we don't have enough money, we don't have enough money. The problem is we need more money. And it was very clear almost immediately that money was a problem, definitely. There was not enough money, but money was not the problem. So when I started at the museum, I had been an organizational consultant for the prior year or 2. And as a consultant, one of the things that I realized is that a problem, there's a visual that I have, which is a problem is like a nail. So let's just picture that your organization, whoever you are out there in the audience, your organization is a plank. It's a wooden plank. And a problem appears in your organization, and it's a nail that gets hammered into that plank. Okay, so we can all see that, right? A board with a nail sticking out. And what we can see, that's a symptom of the problem. The problem is actually continued down below the surface of the wood in that part of the nail that you can't see. A lot of organizations, and it's natural, tend to deal with that by shearing off that nail where they can see it. So they take care of the stuff that they can't see. Boom, problem gone, right? Well, no, the symptom is gone. But what you've actually done is you've made it much harder to deal with the problem, because now you can't see the problem. You have to dig out the little top of the nail. I don't know what you call that, isn't there? So you can't use that. Is it the claw of the hammer? You can't use that to get it out. You have to dig in and grab it. It's a lot more difficult. So just dealing with the symptoms of the problem is a lesson that we want to learn, that's not a good thing. So we set out to identify what the problem was, and fairly quickly we realized that it was that the museum had lost its focus and its vision and its direction. We were so busy dealing with the money and the expansions and the turnover in executive directors that we'd forgotten what was the whole point. What was the museum? Why was the museum? What was it there to accomplish? Why was it critical for the community? So, knowing that that was the problem, we launched a plan to address this. And this is us doing our plan. And actually what the details of the plan aren't as important right now as what happened after we launched this plan. We knew what the problem was. We had a plan to address it. We did it. See us all here, we're busy doing it, and it worked. We had a reopening in January of 2017, 6 months after the reserves had run out. We had enough money. This is the crowd on the opening day. This was great. We hadn't seen crowds like this in a long time. And we got a lot of press. Everything was going great until it stopped. Took about 4 weeks. Took 4 months for us to figure out what the problem, 5 months to figure out the problem and develop a plan and implement it. Took 1 month for it to stop working. And when I say it stopped working, people reverted to old behaviors. The board lost its sense of urgency. There was no fundraising going on. The staff, which had been very disempowered, went back to that feeling of lack of agency. It was actually fascinating if it hadn't been so horrible. I'll just say there are a lot of reasons why Plan 1 didn't work. One of them was that it was a crash diet. We went from eating pizza every day to eating cottage cheese and lettuce. And you can do that for 4 months, but you can't keep it up, right? You just, once the foot is off the gas, you just go back to your old behavior. So that was one of the issues. So I bring that up as a way of saying, even when you think you're out of the woods, you can't just stop pushing. So we started another plan. And in that plan, we cut a bunch of positions. Everybody went on furloughs. We cut our budget by a third, our expenses by a third. So we were living within our means. Boom, right? That should work. Well, it also didn't work. And I put this little picture up because this is literally how I felt almost every day going into the office. It was a really awful time. And Susana, I know you can relate to this. It was just a very, very difficult time. But to be honest, looking this way and feeling this way was the key that got us out of it. Because when I felt this way, I realized I cannot do it alone. I need to ask for help. I put out a call to a group of thought leaders who came together. They met once a week. We went through every possible scenario, just like they did in Pasadena. And at the end, we came up with the realization that there were only 2 scenarios. One is that we could close, and one is that the government could come in. They were the only entity with enough money to give us seed funding to allow us to reinvent ourselves to become sustainable. So this was a crazy idea. One of the board members said this. He said, wait. So you're saying we put a gun to our own head and say, give me all your money or I shoot? And that was what happened. But that plan worked. We got 6 months of funding and we started to work the plan. And we started to really prove that we were doing a U-turn. We were not going to use that money to keep on doing what we had been doing. We were going to use it to raise an endowment. We were going to use it to become more transparent. We were going to use it to become more relevant, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And over the next 6 months, that plan started to come to fruition. Everything's looking great, right? And then this happened. Okay, so again, right now we're in the midst of who knows how many crises at the moment. The Thomas Fire was a huge crisis in December of 2017. And it happened right when we were getting ready to go back to the governmental agencies for more funding. So at that point, we had a choice. The city and the county that were funding us had a lot of other things on their plates. Over 1,000 buildings burned, I mean, just so many things. And it was hard to go, hey, but we're a museum and we're still really, really, really important and we need your funding. It wasn't a huge amount, but tonally it was wrong. So we came up with another plan. We cut our expenses again and we spent a lot of time again, trying to prove why we were so important, trying to prove how we were a partner to help the community at this point in time. Again, getting to that core issue. And ultimately, that worked. And we did get government support for, it was $2.25 million over 5 years. Fantastic. It's a really great foundation, and it is helping us turn ourselves around. We started a reinvention plan. These are the 6 pillars. I'm happy to share this with you. I do want to say government funding comes with a lot of strings attached. Just wanted to point this out. And this may seem onerous. This is a report that we fill out every month, but it's actually been incredibly helpful to us in keeping us on track. It goes on for quite a while. And then I'll just sum up some of the lessons. So I think there are about 6 lessons that I have here that I've touched on. Number 1, the symptom is not the problem. I've talked about that enough. I don't need to talk about it anymore. Number 2, be honest. A lot of the issue with this museum is that people were afraid, really, to acknowledge kind of how bad things were. And once you open up and you acknowledge that, so many more options open up to you. And I think this might be helpful for all of us to think about as we're dealing with Black Lives Matter and what is our museum's role in that? What is our industry's role in that? This is a very tough time. And so anyway, so that's a little lesson there. Number 3, ask for help. I talked about that. If I hadn't asked for help, we would not have gotten out of this. I think this is really important with COVID-19. I think that when the quarantine and shutdown happened in late March, a lot of you probably have been struggling with whether or not to ask for money. And it seems a little, I don't know, might seem a little tone deaf, but I will tell you, people love to help. I mean, not everybody, but people love to be asked for help. People love to feel that they are needed, and asking for help is maybe one of the hardest things one does, but it's important. Don't lose hope. I've shared with you 3 plans that didn't work. I guarantee you in 4 months, I will be able to share with you another plan that didn't work. We're reinventing ourselves again now. Like Juan said, we gave this presentation 3 months ago, and it feels like the world has completely changed. And then lastly, and this I think is really important in the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, they say, don't go there. I think museums need to not do that. Instead, museums, we need to think, don't go here. Do not do what we have been doing in the past. That may be only true for our museum, but it is certainly true for us. We have to be willing to touch the third rails, and we have to be willing to open up and explore avenues that we have felt we didn't belong in. All right, so that is my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing and shut up so that Jeanette can talk. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Elena. I loved about 3 or 4 slides back, anytime a museum becomes a community center. So that was awesome to see. Well, yeah, now it is my great honor to introduce Jeanette. She has assured me there's a bonus in line if I give like a flowery enough introduction, but I'll just stick to the facts on this one. Jeanette came to museum world after a career in fundraising and development and quickly became our executive director. Under her leadership over the past 6 years, she has worked with a myriad of stakeholders from city government to donors to other nonprofit leaders to bring about a laundry list of improvements at the museum. She has started an ambitious capital campaign to reimagine the museum space itself, overseeing increases in participation and attendance, school field trips, earned revenue, individual giving, and perhaps something she's most proud of, led a charge to repatriate objects to indigenous communities. So it is my great honor to introduce my favorite boss, Jeanette Kihs.
How about that? Thank you, Juan. I am going to share my screen now. At least I think I'm going to. Let's try this again. Okay, so our museum was established in 1883 by the Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle. It was established by the community and for the community, and that really remains true today. It was owned by the city of Pacific Grove until they hit, and this is the short version of the story, they hit a roadblock in 2008 with the recession, like many museums did. And because it was solely city owned, they just neglected a lot of the museum as they cut budgets over and over and over again over years. And then they arrived in 2008 with, you know, 1 employee and mostly volunteer run, and really would not put the money into the museum that it really needed. So they were going to close, and a group of concerned citizens formed a 501c3 nonprofit to run the operations of the museum. So today, the city owns the collection and the building, and the museum foundation that I work for runs the operation of the museum. I will switch to the next slide. So in 2009, this is what the Bird Gallery looked like. It was a tired museum. So there were 5 full-time equivalent employees. The collection was an absolute mess. Native American pottery was just stacked one on top of another, like you might your kitchen dishes. Nothing was earthquake proof. We had a lot of rodents. There was a little bit of money from the Museum Association, which was sort of like the friends of the museum in the previous days, but not much. So it was tired, it was dirty, it was infested with rodents. So not a great way to start out, but you know, there was nowhere to go but up, right? So fast forward to today, this is what the Bird Gallery looks like today. And I'm proud to say that this was just a team effort. We now serve over 50,000 people. We have education programs for a variety of youth, and most of them are free. The other thing that I know Juan has worked very hard on, and we're both very proud of, is that about 50% of those students served are from what would typically be underserved communities or communities that don't get to come to the museum much. So we're really proud of reaching out to Southern Monterey County and including those students. So we have a $1 million endowment now, and we have 13 full-time equivalent employees. I should go back, sorry. Oh, I guess I'm not going back. I will just add to say that the museum was reaccredited by the American Alliance of Museums in 2011. And we have hands-on field trips, which, as I said, are free, community science programs, and now the collection, which we don't add too much, includes over 30,000 objects, which are now stored properly. That took years of inventorying repeatedly and care for the collection. That was one of the priorities in 2008, 2009. And I mentioned that, or maybe Juan mentioned that we're in a capital campaign. We've raised $1.8 million of our $2.1 million goal. And the slide that I just showed had, let's see if I can go back. This was our first gallery redo, the first kickoff of the capital campaign. So that's super exciting. Our next remodel happens to be a children's exhibit for ages 0 to 5, and it is nearly done and was set to open in May. But you know, in pandemic, you pivot and you make other plans. So my first tip, I think, in forming this public-private partnership with the City of Pacific Grove, and I would say that it's a very successful public-private partnership. We have a great relationship. I think the first thing that was done well was negotiate well. Negotiate this agreement with whatever entity if you're entering a public-private partnership well, so that you can think of future growth. So in this instance, it started out with a sliding payment from the city that started larger, and then at first it was a set amount, but the attorney that crafted all of this for us was very forward thinking, and he set up a percentage basis, knowing that the better the city does better, we do better. And so, and their contribution goes up. So this was, in the negotiation process, there were just a lot of things that were thought of well in advance of need. So I would say the first tip is negotiate well if you're entering into any type of agreement with a public entity. Set boundaries. We did this very early on. Set very clear boundaries between the city and the new board. So the city has the collection and the facility, as I mentioned, and then the museum board is the 501c3 foundation board. So we set very clear boundaries between what is the city's purview and what it's not. So an example would be, at first they wanted more information about the foundation board meetings. And we said, no, that's not our policy. We had a policy that, you know, no visitors at board meetings, and we don't share minutes at board meetings. So very early on, that was a clear boundary. It's not the city's job, nor have they tried to influence exhibits or programs. So that's awesome. The other boundary that's very clear is between the board and the staff. We have and always have had, to some degree, of more success than others. Certainly it's not always been easy, but we have very clear boundaries about the board's job in their governance role and not in operations. Now, this is sometimes, I'll admit, a conversation that I have to have when we bring on a new board member and they forget this and they sort of overstep the bounds, and I need to have the conversation right away to nip that in the bud. It's a boundary that I believe is healthiest, in best practices, it's healthiest for any nonprofit and board, but particularly for a museum, not to influence exhibits or programs or operations more than a suggestion. It's very important that the board not have, you know, email employees about a certain program, for instance. It just sets up a lot of uncomfortable confusion. So I would say that this is a very important boundary, and one that I continue to make sure happens. Be transparent. I think this is really important, and Elena said the same thing. You know, we built trust by sharing all the information that we possibly could to take away some of the worry that people had along the way in the beginning. We shared often, more often than was necessary. I have a completely open office as far as questions. People in the very beginning would come to me and dump all this history on me. And, you know, I don't want this to happen anymore. And I just let them talk and developed the relationships so that we could be as transparent as possible, and they could, and we built trust that way. So by sharing what we could about the operations of the museum without messing with the boundaries there, and allowing people to ask any questions that they want, or bring forward worries without indulging, but just listening. So we set up that sort of transparent, open communication, and I believe that has allowed the community to trust us more than they did in the beginning. Make a plan. So we made our, well, before we made our first strategic plan, we gathered all the board together and made sure that everyone was in agreement about the direction of the museum. So there was a lot of exercises and a lot of reading that went into where do we want to be as a museum, and it was important that the board and staff agree upon that direction. So the board and staff developed a very workable strategic plan. We're already in the second edit of that plan. And we formed committees. So we got buy-in from the community, we got buy-in from volunteers, staff, board members. So it started with board and then extended out. We had 6 goals and we made a committee for each goal. And so we really work through the plan, and then we really follow the plan. It really influences our work plan. We're now in our like I said, our second version of that plan, and everyone's in agreement about where we're going, which is important. Focus. In the beginning, everything needed attention. You know, there were rodents. The collection was a mess. It was, where do you start, right? But we had to start somewhere, and so we started with cleaning up the collection. We started with financials. We felt like cleaning up the collection management and financials were the most important. And in the beginning, we had a lot of people come to us, oh, can you do this education program? And in the beginning, we sort of took them all on if they fit our broad mission. But what we learned through that is that we needed to focus on what we could scale up and focus on what was financially sustainable. So now there's no question when someone comes to us with a program possibility, is it financially sustainable? Does it fit our strategic plan, our strategic direction of the museum? And can we scale it up over time? So that influences how we make decisions. And we found through trial and error that it was very important to focus on the big things in the beginning and learn how to scale and make programs sustainable. I think I'm getting near the end of the time, which is perfect. I would say the other big thing is that it's tempting to think that money will solve everything, right? But I realize that just like time, we never have enough money. We never have enough time. And especially now in this time of pandemic, it's, you know, the new normal, and there certainly is never enough money. But I'm proud of the job that the museum is doing and still is doing today. You know, we've been able to retain our entire staff during this pandemic time and are looking forward to opening. I'm proudest of the fact that the museum is a much more inclusive, community-minded space than it was in 2008, 2009, and 2013, 14. All types of people come and feel comfortable in the museum now, and I'm very proud of that. I think at the end of the day, doing the right thing drives all of our decisions, and it means that we need to have, and I need to have, difficult conversations on a regular basis, right? Telling the whole truth and being completely transparent is not always the easiest thing. Sometimes it would be easier to ignore the board member who oversteps or what have you. And so I would say that those difficult conversations we need to get comfortable with. And in this time of pandemic, we're getting comfortable with being uncomfortable about the unknown future. And so I think it's along those same lines: get comfortable with the difficult conversations and stick to your plan and your values. But I appreciate the time. I appreciate each and every one of you who are on this webinar, and my co-presenters, and especially our moderator. I appreciate working with them every day. So thank you.
Cool. Well, thank you, everybody. We were going to do question and answer time, and Lacey, I wanted to ask you if there's perhaps a way to collect questions in some way such that we could ask them in the future, we could answer them in the future. I know at the seminar or session at CAM, at the conference, there was a lot of great questions and a lot of great advice from all three of these women. So I'd be curious, Lacey, if there's anything that we can do before we sign off here in the next minute or two.
That's a great question, Juan, and I think that would be really helpful, especially since the recording will be posted to YouTube. There might be questions that come up from viewers who view the recording. So I'll let everyone on the call today know that they are welcome to email me with questions. I can collect them and share with presenters and post answers in the YouTube notes if that if that works for people. And if the presenters are willing to share their contact information, just let me know, and I can also include that in the YouTube notes for folks.
Cool. And I think you have a couple of things to plug, correct?
Yes, we do actually have a question. I just saw it pop up. Okay, Jeanette answered it. Sorry. Yes, thank you. I'll just, since we're coming up on time, I will thank everyone again for joining CAM's Lunch and Learn program today. Special thank you to our presenters. We are so grateful to have learned from you, and thank you, Juan, for moderating so beautifully.
Thank you.
I just wanted to let everyone know that this Lunch and Learn is part of a summer series. So the upcoming dates are here on this slide. Half of them are like this one, which was a repeat of a really successful session that we had at CAM's conference earlier this year. And the other half are case studies by our CAM fellows. So I encourage you all to take a look at our website. It's down there at the bottom. I'll write it in the chat box, and register for what's coming up as well. And thank you.
Thank you, Lacey. Thank you, Cam, for all you do.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Two.